Good day, it's Pastor Jed here at Eau Claire Evangelical Missionary Church. This is part 2 of our Advent series for this year, 2025. As you see, 2 candles are lit now, and this is our key verse when it comes to lighting the candles part of our Advent this year. And it is from 2 John chapter 3. May God the Father and Jesus Christ, the Father Son, give us grace, mercy, and peace. And may they be ours in truth and love. And we had Adelaide talking about how God is just so merciful. And merciful is forgiving, even though someone has done something wrong to you. And there's no greater example than it is found in the life of Jesus Christ. So that's what those the representing of the second candle behind me. Now we're going to get into today's message. And the message part of today is specifically about what, because we're going through who, what, when and where, why, and how of Christmas. And specifically today, we're not just talking about what. We know what Jesus came. That's what Advent means. Jesus came and he's coming again. That's also a part of Advent quite often. We celebrate he's coming back. But what I want to do today is really look at what did Jesus do while he was on earth to show us that he was God in the flesh? That's what Emmanuel is, the way that we often sing, O come, Emmanuel. How did he show us that he was who he says he was? Well, to do that, we're going to be starting off in Luke chapter 7, and we're going to see some of the miracles that Jesus was doing and how that spread. There were reports about him going all over the place. Just to set it up, the beginning of Luke 7 talks about Jesus healing a centurion's servant. So no wonder there's reports going out about him. He doesn't only heal Jewish people, he even heals the Romans. What's up with that? Let's hear the rest of this, and then we'll hear from John the Baptist and some of his disciples. And it's in Jesus' response to John the Baptist that we find really the heart and soul of today's message about what Jesus did to show he was the one. Let's get into it. Luke chapter 7, and we're going to be starting partway through the chapter. Specifically, we're going to be reading from verse 11. So Luke chapter 7 and verse 11. Here we go.
Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, accompanied by his disciples and a large crowd. Just as he arrived at the gate of the town, a funeral procession was coming out. The dead man was the only son of a woman who was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart was filled with pity for her, and he said to her, "Don't cry." Then he walked over and touched the coffin, and the men carrying stopped. Jesus said, "Young man, get up, I tell you." The man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They all were filled with the fear and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to save his people." The news about Jesus went out through all the country and the surrounding territory. When John's disciples told him about all these things, he called 2 of them and sent them to the Lord to ask him, "Are you the one John said was going to come, and should we expect someone else?" When they came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to ask if you are the one he said was going to come, or if we should expect someone else." At that very time, Jesus cured many people of their sicknesses, diseases, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many blind people. He answered John's messengers, "Go back and tell John what you have seen and heard, and the blind can see, the lame can walk, those who suffer from dreaded skin diseases are made clean, the deaf can hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is preached to the poor. How happy are those who have no doubts about me."
Okay, so there was 6 points that Jesus gave to the disciples of John the Baptist to show that he was the guy. Now, think about John the Baptist. At this point, he's asking, going, I need to know, Jesus, are you really the guy? Because if you're not, somehow I got to get out of prison. Because John's job specifically was to proclaim and prepare the way for the coming Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah. And if Jesus is the one, then he's good. He doesn't even need to be let out of prison. In fact, he'll probably be executed, and he's okay. That's his job is done. He will have a good record and a well done, faithful servant. But if Jesus isn't really the guy, then John's got to get out of prison. So as a result of Jesus' response, John would have known that his life is basically over. He's kind of, it's not what we would consider the best for retirement, but this is where it is. He's in prison the rest of his days until he is executed. Spoiler alert, John the Baptist gets executed. In case you didn't know that story, you can look it up in the Bible. It's not a pleasant episode, and yet at the same time it's glorious because he stood up for truth and righteousness and gave his life for God. And even when we die, God wins in a case like that. But let's go back to that thing that Jesus was talking about. What are the signs? What is it that he said to John's disciples? He said, "Go back and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind can see, the lame can walk, those who suffer from dreaded skin diseases known as leprosy are made clean, and the deaf can hear. The dead are raised to life, and the good news is preached to the poor. And happy are those who have no doubts about me." We're going to go through how Jesus demonstrated these. In fact, these are miracles. Specifically, if we start out in John chapter 9, we can hear the story of Jesus healing. We're going to look at individual moments where Jesus did these specific things. So John 9 tells the story of a man who was actually born blind. So he's never seen his entire life. Now, in that culture, in that tradition, at that time, then somebody did something wrong. Obviously, for him to have such a hard life, either his parents or somehow in the womb, he sinned. Therefore, he's born blind. Great theological argument for the Sadducees and Pharisees. Jesus is like, no, that's not what it's about. But right now, his life is going to give God glory. How does Jesus heal the blind man? He comes to the blind man knowing that he's been blind his whole life. Someone's probably told him that. And he spits on the ground, and he makes a salve out of the spit and the dirt, rubs it on the guy's eyes, and says, "I want you to go wash." But he has to walk quite a ways to get to this pool to wash. And as he's washed, he's healed. Suddenly he can see. However, there's one little problem with this. Besides, the ick factor of Jesus spitting and making the mud. There's a little ick factor that we should admit to. But he did this on a Sabbath day. This is against the rules according to the Jewish religion at the time. It's against the rules. You're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath that is not related specifically to the temple, and that's only for a few people. Otherwise, you're not supposed to do any work whatsoever, and they had strict limits on that. Jesus argued often with the rules and rituals of the day because they weren't actually scriptural. They were barriers to keeping from God. And in this case, he did good. Jesus did a good thing on the day of rest. And God is good, and he likes it when we do good things on the day of rest. This is when he had the opportunity to heal this man. So he took it and caused a massive controversy, by the way. In fact, this man was brought into the synagogue. People were angry, saying, "Well, what happened? How did he heal you?" And it's like, "Well, he made mud and rubbed it in my eyes, and he told me to go wash." And it's like, "Well, this man couldn't have been of God because he asked you to do this on the Sabbath. How dare he break our traditions and rules?" And he's like, "Well, I don't know if he's a prophet or not." They're like, "Well, we're not even sure that you were really born blind. We're not sure about that." So they brought his parents in, and his parents, a little afraid they'd get kicked out of synagogue, said, "Why do you ask him? He's old enough to answer for himself." And so they asked him again. He said, "Well, do you want to become a follower of him? I've already told you." And they're like, "What do you think of this guy?" And his response is, "Well, he must be a prophet. Nobody's ever heard. What, are you crazy? Nobody's ever done this before. But someone who's born blind. It's one thing to heal somebody who had sight, but not somebody who's born blind." And they say to him, No, it can't be that. And he said, I like the response of the guy. He's like, whether he's a prophet or not, whether he's a sinner or not, I was blind, but now I can see. So they kicked him out of the temple. And then he connects to Jesus. That's one of the reports that's going around that John the Baptist would have heard of how he made the blind see. Let's look in a little further back in the Gospel of John. In John chapter 5, we can see the second point, which is the lame walk. The story here, and we're storying through these just to give an idea of this is what Jesus has been doing to show he's the guy. He's the one, John. Pay attention. You're good. John, you're done. I'm here. At this place called Bethsaida in Hebrew, there's a pool. It's near it's in Jerusalem, near the Sheep Gate, and it's kind of this mystical pool. It's more superstitious. It's not really fond of necessarily by the Jewish people because there's like this, the water gets stirred up and starts to bubble, and whoever gets in there first, often they'd get some sort of healing. So there's all kinds of crippled and different people there, and there was one man who had been there for 38 years. So he's probably much older than that. He probably wasn't brought there as an infant. He might have been there since maybe he was 12 or 13. But for these years, he's never been able to get there. Every time the water bubbles up, he just can't get there. Someone else always gets there in front of him. It's a little bit on the superstitious side. It's like the first one to get there gets it. And Jesus walks in and realizes this guy's been here a long time. He walks up to the man and he says, "Do you want to be healed?" And the man's response is, "Nobody can help me. Are you going to help me get to the pool? Because nobody helps me to get to the pool." And Jesus really gets down at his level. Do you want to be healed? And then he says, "Then get up, pick up your bed, and walk away." And the man believes Jesus. Somehow it clicks. And suddenly maybe he felt feeling in his toes. Maybe his toes cracked for the first time. Imagine how freeing that would feel. I like to sometimes have my toes cracked, and sometimes it really isn't comfortable. But imagine that. Maybe just all of a sudden he has feelings in his legs where he's like, wow, I haven't felt my legs for years, decades. But he gets up, rolls up his mat, because that's what his bed is. It's just a mat, and begins to walk away. We have a problem here again. This is another one of the 7 or so times where Jesus specifically heals a person on the Sabbath day. And it's supposed to be, remember, you're not supposed to do any work. So carrying a bedroll was considered work. You can't do that. The point of Sabbath is not about not doing things. It's about connecting to God and resting. But they didn't get that. They're all about the rules. And so the man gets into trouble, and it's like, "Who healed you?" And it's like, "Well, Jesus healed me." And Jesus is like, isn't it good that you've been healed? And then he also says, "You're well now. Stop sinning or something worse will happen to you." So he had made this lame man well. But he also warned him, because Jesus does that sometimes. He's like, "Hey, great, I'm going to get you out of this mess, but don't keep sinning, or something worse could come and happen to you." That's a pretty sobering thought. And it's not my words. These are Jesus' words. But he heals this man. So there's reports about this going around. Now we go back to Luke chapter 7, and we'll look through. So he's making the blind see, and he's making the lame to walk. Well, what's the next thing that it lists? Well, it says that those who suffer from dreaded skin diseases like leprosy are healed. Jesus doesn't break the Sabbath law on this one, but we hear in the very beginning of Mark, not even till the end of chapter 1. So we're at the end of chapter 1, and Jesus is walking out of Capernaum after a few days of ministry on to his next town. Because he tells his disciples, "What I've just done in Capernaum, I have to do in other places. I gotta tell people about the kingdom, the good news. The kingdom of God is here. Repent and believe." That's Jesus' message. But as he's walking out, and he's on the road to whatever next town they're going to, doesn't tell us, a leper comes up to him and kneels at his feet and says, "If you're willing, I know, Jesus, you can make me clean." He's not had much human contact. Leprosy is a very contagious disease, and you do not want to get in contact with it. That's why that even in the Old Testament, God does have different laws to make sure to find out and determine if this is leprosy. And if you are leprous, there's certain things and procedures you're supposed to follow. And Jesus comes to him. First of all, he comes within the 6 feet barrier. Then he goes further and he lays his hand on the man. He says, "I'm willing. Be clean." And the leprosy immediately leaves him. Now, the man doesn't do a good job of obeying Jesus right away. He hasn't been to synagogue for a long time. Maybe we can cut him some slack. But Jesus tells him, "I want you to go back to synagogue. I want you to prove to the priests and pay the sacrifice that is in the Old Testament about this." They didn't call it the Old Testament. They just called it the law. Go pay the sacrifice and let the priest know that you're clean now. But don't tell anyone else. But the word about this spreads, and so Jesus now has to camp whenever he goes to a town. But he healed this leper in an amazing way. Again, going against what the common sense would have said, what religious practices were. He reached out, touched the man, and he was made whole. Then the next one is in that list, going back to Luke chapter 7, with that encounter with John the Baptist. He says, "I make the deaf hear." And there's a story about this also in the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to just hear that story. This is Mark chapter 7, and starting in verse 31, if you want to follow along in your Bibles. I'm going to review the story so you can catch the gist of what Jesus was doing. So Jesus is leaving the neighborhood of Tyre, and he went to Sidon and Lake Galilee, and he's going by the way of 10 towns. By the way, the 10 towns it's called the Decapolis, which means 10 towns. Metropolis is big town, Decapolis is 10 towns, and it's where the Gentiles live. The non-Jewish people mixed together with some of the Jews, and that's where they tend to settle together. We still have that today. When people move into a country, they tend to cluster into groups. We have that in Canada. People tend to cluster when they move here. This is where the Gentiles were living, in this Decapolis. And they brought him a man who was deaf and mute. That happens often. People that are deaf, they wouldn't have had the training and skills that we have nowadays to help deaf people communicate the same way. American Sign Language isn't invented yet. There's no America yet. So this person has a really hard time communicating, and he's deaf. And Jesus does something, again, pretty weird, because first of all, everyone wants him to do this miracle, like in the center of town. He's like, no, let's take a moment of privacy. Takes him out of town. And then he puts his fingers in the man's ears and spat and touched the man's tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and gave a deep groan and said, "Epaphra." I'm just messing it up. In English, he said, "Open up." And at once the man was able to hear, and he could speak clearly at the same time. So double miracle. He could hear and speak the perfect language of those around him. Really cool, but I'm going to let you know, a lot of these miracles, I'm going to say, are descriptive. Does God ask us every time to walk up and touch somebody with a contagious disease? I'm going to say that's a description of the event that happened, but it's not a prescription. See, when you take a prescription from medication, it means this is the way you have to do it every time. Some prescriptions I've had over the years, take with food twice daily. There's other ones that it's like, no, take once a day without food. You got to follow the prescription. Some people take some of the miracles of Jesus as a prescription. This is how you have to do it. It's not very common to hear lots of people spitting and making mud. And right now in Northern Ontario at Christmas time, I can't find mud to spit on and rub into people's eyes. I guess I could rub snow into their eyes, but that's not the same thing. Those are descriptions of what Jesus said. One that's particular is when Jesus comes across a man who is demon possessed, and he asks him and says, "What is your name?" And the response is "Our name is Legion, because there were many demons in the man." You don't actually have to know the name of whatever thing you're dealing with for God to heal, because that's the only time he did that. That's a description, not a prescription. So I just want to be clear about all these miracles, and you don't have to always go out of your way to bother religious folk, though it can be fun. Let's be honest. Although it can be very frustrating, because people that have more of a rules-based and religious bent can be very unhappy. So let's get back to this miracle. Jesus does this amazing miracle, and actually people are overwhelmed. They're like stunned. They're like, "Wow, he does everything right. He does everything well." So this is the example. There's multiple examples, but of like Jesus getting together with crowds. But here's an individual incident where the deaf are healed. The last one, where we talked about Jesus raising someone from the dead, because he told that to John. And I think he's specifically referring to what he just did in the town of Nain, where he walked up to that casket and touched it and said to the young man, "Get up." Now think of how amazing that would have been for the widow. That young man represented both her future and any ties she had to her past, because that's her son, and she's a widow, so she doesn't have her husband around anymore. So that's that link to the past, and her future is tied with, because really they're supposed to look after their parents in Jewish culture. One of the children, often the firstborn, looks after the parents. That's like Jesus on the cross. He's dying on the cross. He looks and he sees John, his disciple, his good friend, his close friend. He says, "John, that's your mom. Mom, that's your son," says to Mary. And so from that point on, John took Mary and took care of her, because that would have been Jesus' responsibility to pass on. Getting back to this here, the raising from the dead, I think, was that widow from Nain, and that's that young man raising from the dead. Now the reason I say that is because this is still fairly early or mid-ministry of Jesus. So it's not raising of Lazarus. Lazarus is raised very shortly and not far from when Jesus comes into Jerusalem for the last time for his triumphal entry, and then there's his execution and his resurrection. Lazarus being raised from the dead is very close to that chronologically. So that report wouldn't have been spread to John the Baptist. He's been dead for a while. Remember, John the Baptist dies partway through Jesus' ministry. And the other moment when Jesus raised someone from the dead isn't really public knowledge. People are like, we think something happened like that, but we're not sure, because Jesus was on his way back from ministering on the other side of Lake Galilee and meets a man named Jairus. And on the way, Jairus' daughter is sick and dying, not dead yet, but unfortunately the crowd gets stopped and the girl dies. Now it's really cool because the crowd gets stopped because a woman gets healed, and her 12-year menstrual cycle, ladies, think of that, is healed. And again, a little unconventional, because she touched him. And she's not supposed to touch anyone, because that would make them unclean. But Jesus isn't supposed to touch a dead body either, because touching a dead body is going to make you unclean, which is the next thing that Jesus does. Because on the way there, they find out your daughter's died. The mourners are all there. So there are people in the house that know she's died, but Jesus sends them all out except for Peter, James, and John, and the mother and the father. And he says to the little girl, takes his hand, says, "Little girl, I tell you, get up." And she gets up, and being a hungry teenager, or just about, she's 12 years old, they give her something to eat. That's the first thing Jesus recommends. But it's not as though that was witnessed by a large crowd. And Jesus specifically tells everyone there, this isn't for spreading. It's a good opportunity to learn, but it's not for spreading around. Now the last one. The poor have the good news preached to them. I'm going to refer back to the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. The beginning of the Sermon on the Mount starts with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." Every one of us that realize that we don't have what it takes in our own strength, that's what it means to be poor in spirit. So when he's saying the poor have the gospel preached to them, the good news, he means everybody that realizes they don't have what it takes. But at the same time, it was the rich, political, religious elite who tended to preach to the rich, political people of the day, because that's how you get a better church, you get a better, bigger synagogue, you get more money. So these are all some of the things that happen. But Jesus specifically tends to go out of his way to spend time with outcasts and people on the fringes of society. Oh yeah, he has meals with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious people too, but he seems to go out of his way to hang out with the poor, and they respond. In fact, if we go to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it's the people that say, "Wow, did you hear that? This guy preaches like he knows what he's talking about. He preaches with authority. Wow, this is different." So that's where we see all these points, where Jesus is showing to everyone, but he's actually specifically showing one person at this time, John the Baptist. Yeah, these are all the signs and the reasons that you can count on. I am the one who is to come. He's the one that we're celebrating at Advent. But then there's that verse that concludes this section. It says, "Blessed is the one who is not offended by me," or who doesn't have doubts about me. I like that phrase where it says, "Blessed is the one who isn't offended by me," because there's a lot of people that are offended by Jesus. In fact, there's some churches that Jesus would walk into today and they would be offended by him because he doesn't always do things according to the way we've always done them. And he might hang out with people that we might be suspicious of. Why are you hanging out with those people? So you're blessed if you can just look at Jesus and go, that's the kind of life I want to live. It doesn't necessarily make me comfortable, but I want to be the kind of person that loves like Jesus because he's loving through me, have mercy on people because Jesus has mercy on me, and to be recognized as him. So the question at the end of all this, because we saw what Jesus did to show he is the Messiah, the one who was to come, and he changed everything through his death and resurrection. He didn't, if we actually just ask the quick question, what did Jesus do when he was on earth? Well, he did these miracles and signs to show he was the guy. He's God, but he's also human. And he came to change things. That's one thing he did. He did miracles. He taught people. But specifically, he took 12 misfits, we can call them. They were not the elite. They were not the best scholars. There's a couple mama's boys. There's some fishermen. There's some nobodies. There's a tax collector. There's a terrorist or patriot, depending on your point of view. And he takes these guys and trains them in ministry. Remember that part where Jesus took Peter, James, and John, and they healed that little girl? Peter had the same opportunity when someone invited him over from a different town and said, we need your help. And they bring him upstairs, and what does he find? He finds the corpse of a woman named Dorcas. And he does the exact sort of thing that Jesus did in that moment. He was paying attention. These guys were being trained up. So that's the second thing that Jesus did. And then the third thing is he took the hit that we all as human beings deserved when he died in our place, betrayed on the cross. And then he demonstrated that he was definitely God when he was resurrected. So at the end, the question is how are you connecting with this one who came to do so much for so many? My encouragement with you is to connect with him. Get to know him. and allow him to change your life. And let's just see what God can do with it. Have a great week. God bless.